My wife burst into the house in a rage, screaming, "Why isn't the card working? Mom didn't get your salary." I calmly replied, "Interesting." At the time, she didn't know that I had already discovered their work relationship, and that the card issue was only the first domino. The next blow would hit during a work meeting. Bree Holloway ran into our kitchen like a tornado in designer heels, her face flushed with the kind of anger that comes from public embarrassment. She'd just returned from lunch with her mother, and apparently, the credit card had been declined at some overpriced bistro downtown. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was furious about money she'd never earned being unavailable for spending she couldn't afford. "Darren!" she shouted, slamming her purse on the granite countertop we'd bought during better times. "What did you do to the accounts?" I looked up from my laptop, where I'd been reviewing security protocols for my latest IT contracting gig. The screen showed a banking app with a very deliberate zero balance on our joint checking account. I'd moved every penny to a new account she didn't know existed, one that required only my signature and authorization. "I didn't do anything unusual," I said, keeping my voice level. "Just some routine financial reorganization." Her eyes narrowed. Bree had always been sharp when it came to reading people. It's what made her good at her project management job at Meridian Financial. But she'd gotten sloppy lately, probably because she thought I was too focused on my work to notice what she was really up to. "Don't play games with me," she snapped. "Mom's card was declined too. The supplementary account, the one tied to your direct deposit." She was mortified. "Mortified," I repeated, savoring the word. "That's unfortunate." What Bree didn't know was that a week earlier I'd been in our home office syncing tax documents from her laptop to our shared cloud storage. It was routine. We'd done it every quarter for years. But this time, I'd noticed some files that didn't belong in her personal folders. Work calendars, expense reports, and email threads that painted a very clear picture of what my wife had been doing with her time. And with whom. The files showed a pattern going back 8 months. Bree had been routing project approvals through her mother, who'd somehow gotten herself registered as a consulting contractor with Meridian Financial. Every project Bree managed generated a secondary payment to Mrs. Carden Consulting Services, payments that ranged from $500 to $3,000 per month. But that wasn't the most interesting part. The most interesting part was the email thread between Bree and Kyle Reddick, the department director who'd been signing off on these arrangements. The thread that detailed their lunch meetings, their weekend strategy sessions, and their plans to expand the consulting arrangement once Kyle got his promotion to regional manager. The thread that also included photos I definitely wasn't supposed to see. I'd exported everything. Every file, every email, every calendar entry. I'd saved them with headers intact, timestamps preserved, metadata included. Then I'd printed the most damaging evidence and stored it in a safety deposit box I'd opened that same afternoon. "The account isn't frozen," I told Bree, which was technically true. "It's just been restructured." She pulled out her phone and started tapping furiously. "I'm calling the bank." "Go ahead," I said. "They'll tell you that the account holder, that would be me since it's tied to my salary, requested that all authorized users be removed pending a financial review." The color drained from her face. "You can't do that. We're married. I have rights." "You have the rights I give you," I replied, closing my laptop. "And right now, I'm not feeling particularly generous." I stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at our quiet suburban street. Mrs. Patterson was walking her dog. Mr. Chen was washing his car. Normal people living normal lives, probably not embezzling money through fake consulting contracts or having affairs with their supervisors. "What is this really about?" Bree asked, and for the first time, her voice carried a note of uncertainty. I turned back to face her. She was still beautiful, tall, blonde, with the kind of polished appearance that opened doors in corporate America. But now I saw something else in her expression. Fear. "It's about accountability," I said. "It's about consequences for choices." You're being cryptic, and it's annoying, she shot back, but the fire was going out of her voice. Am I? I walked back to the counter and picked up my laptop. Let me be more direct then. How's Kyle doing these days? Still working on that promotion? The change in her expression was immediate and unmistakable. Surprise, then panic, then a desperate attempt to look confused. Kyle? You mean Kyle Reddick from work? I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you don't. I headed toward the stairs. By the way, you might want to check your work email tomorrow. I think there's going to be an interesting development. Darren, wait! She followed me to the bottom of the staircase. What did you do? I paused on the third step and looked down at her. I sent some documents to your HR department. Just some financial records that I thought they might find interesting. You know how compliance departments are? They get so excited about undisclosed conflicts of interest. The look on her face was worth every moment of planning I'd put into this. Pure, unadulterated terror. You can't, she whispered. You don't understand the situation. I understand it perfectly, I said. The question is, do you understand yours? I left her standing at the bottom of the stairs and went to our bedroom. My bedroom, as of yesterday, when I'd had the locks changed. She'd been staying late at the office so much lately that she hadn't even noticed I'd moved all her belongings to the guest room. From my window I could see her getting into her car, probably heading to Kyle's apartment to warn him about the storm that was coming. But it was too late for warnings. I'd already sent the compliance report to Meridian's HR director, along with copies to the department heads and the internal audit team. The meeting was scheduled for tomorrow at 10 a.m. Bree would walk into that conference room thinking it was a routine project review, and instead, she'd find herself facing questions about financial irregularities and undisclosed relationships. I sat down at my desk and opened a new document on my computer. At the top, I typed, divorce petition, grounds, financial misconduct, and breach of marital trust. Then I started writing. The next morning, I was in my home office by 6 a.m., monitoring the situation through various digital channels I'd established over the past week. One of the advantages of working in IT security is understanding how information flows through corporate networks and how to position yourself to observe that flow without being detected. Bree had left the house before dawn, probably thinking she could get to the office early and do damage control. What she didn't know was that I'd already spoken with Janet Morrison, Meridian's HR director, the previous evening. Janet and I had worked together on a security audit 2 years ago, and she remembered me as thorough and reliable. Darren, she'd said when I called, this is quite serious. Are you sure about these allegations? I'm sure about the documentation, I'd replied. Whether it constitutes misconduct is your department's call, but I thought you should see it before any more contracts get approved. Now, I was watching the digital fallout unfold in real time. I'd set up monitoring on several email accounts, nothing illegal, just observing publicly available information and using access credentials that Bree had carelessly left logged in on our shared computer. At 8:47 a.m., Kyle Reddick sent an urgent message to his assistant, asking her to reschedule all his morning meetings. At 9:15, Bree tried calling her mother 6 times in a row. At 9:33, Mrs. Carden called Meridian Financial directly, asking to speak with someone about irregular account activity. I poured myself a cup of coffee and settled in to watch the show. At exactly 10 a.m., my phone rang. The caller ID showed Bree's office number. Hello, I answered, keeping my tone neutral. You bastard, she hissed. You absolute bastard. Do you have any idea what you've done? I've reported financial irregularities to the appropriate compliance department, I said. I thought that was the responsible thing to do. They suspended me, she said, her voice shaking. Pending investigation. They suspended Kyle too, and they've frozen all payments to outside contractors until they can review the approval process. That sounds like a reasonable precaution, I replied. Reasonable? She was practically shrieking now. Darren, this could ruin my career. This could ruin everything. Yes, I said simply. It could. There was a long pause. I could hear voices in the background, probably other employees discussing the morning's drama. What do you want? She finally asked. I want you to come home, I said. We need to have a conversation. I can't leave. They want me to stay available for questions. Then I guess you'll have to choose between dealing with HR and dealing with me, I said. But I should mention that I've prepared some additional documentation that might be relevant to their investigation. Whether I share it depends on how our conversation goes. Another pause. What kind of additional documentation? The kind that includes photographs, I said, and hung up. She was home within an hour. I was waiting in the living room when she came through the front door. She looked terrible. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, her makeup was smudged, and her hands were shaking. Sit down, I said, gesturing to the chair across from the couch where I was sitting. She remained standing. What photographs? I reached into the folder beside me and pulled out a stack of printouts, email screenshots, calendar entries, and yes, photographs that Kyle had been stupid enough to send through the company messaging system. Nothing explicit, but definitely not appropriate for workplace communication. These photographs, I said, fanning them out on the coffee table between us. She sank into the chair like her legs had given out. How long have you known? She asked quietly. About the money? A week. About Kyle? I shrugged. I started suspecting 3 months ago when you suddenly became very interested in working late and attending weekend conferences. But I didn't confirm it until I found these files. She stared at the papers on the table. It's not what you think. Really? Because what I think is that you've been embezzling money through your mother's fake consulting company while having an affair with your supervisor. If it's not that, please enlighten me. The consulting fees were legitimate, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Mom has experience in project management. She was providing real value. Your mother has a high school education and hasn't worked in 30 years, I replied. The only value she was providing was a way to funnel money out of your department's budget and into your personal accounts. And Kyle? She looked up at me, and for a moment, I saw something that might have been genuine regret. Kyle was a mistake, she said. It just happened. We were working closely together, spending a lot of time on projects, and things got complicated. Things got complicated, I repeated. That's an interesting way to describe adultery. Don't be self-righteous, she snapped, some of her old fire returning. You've been checked out of this marriage for years. When was the last time we went anywhere together? When was the last time you showed any interest in my work, my goals, my life? When was the last time you told me the truth about any of those things? I countered. It's hard to show interest in someone's life when they're lying about what that life actually involves. She stood up and started pacing. So what now? You've destroyed my career, you've humiliated me in front of my colleagues, and you've probably ruined my mother's reputation. Are you satisfied? Not even close, I said. She stopped pacing. What do you mean? I stood up and walked to the window. Kyle's BMW was parked across the street. He'd apparently followed her here, probably to coordinate their stories or plan their next move. I mean, this is just the beginning, I said. You and Kyle made a choice to betray me, to steal from your company, and to lie about it for months. Now you get to experience the consequences of those choices. Darren, please, she said, and her voice was smaller now. We can work this out. We can go to counseling. We can figure out how to fix this. I turned back to face her. Fix this? Bree, you've been stealing money and cheating on me. You've involved your mother in financial fraud. You've compromised your professional integrity and probably violated multiple company policies. What exactly do you think we're going to fix? Our marriage, she said desperately. We can save our marriage. Our marriage ended the day you decided Kyle was worth more to you than I was, I replied. Everything that's happening now is just paperwork. She sank back into the chair, and for the first time since I'd known her, Bree looked truly defeated. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. I walked back to the couch and sat down. "I want you to understand that actions have consequences. I want you to experience what it feels like to lose everything you thought you could take for granted. And I want you to know that every bit of what's happening to you is the direct result of choices you made." "You're enjoying this," she said, looking up at me with something like horror. "Yes," I said simply. "I am." Kyle Reddick was everything I'd expected him to be. Tall, expensively dressed, with the kind of confident arrogance that comes from never having faced real consequences for anything. When he knocked on my door an hour after Bree left, I almost admired his audacity. "We need to talk," he said when I opened the door. "Do we?" I replied, not moving aside to let him in. He looked past me into the house. "This has gone far enough, Darren. You've made your point." "Have I?" I stepped out onto the front porch, closing the door behind me. "What point do you think I was making?" "Look, I understand you're upset," he said, adopting what I assumed was his professional negotiation tone. "But destroying Bree's career isn't going to solve anything. She's a good employee, and what happened between us, that's personal. It doesn't have anything to do with her work performance." I studied his face for a moment. He genuinely seemed to believe that he could talk his way out of this situation, that the right combination of words would make me back down and let them both return to their comfortable arrangement. "You're right," I said finally. "It is personal, very personal. So we can work something out," he said, relaxing slightly. "Man to man. Maybe we can find a way to resolve this without involving the company any further. What did you have in mind?" "Well," he said, warming to his theme, "obviously you and Bree have some things to work out. But there's no reason to drag Meridian into your marital problems. If you were to clarify your complaint with HR, explain that you misunderstood some of the documentation, we could probably get this whole thing dismissed." "In exchange for what?" "In exchange for me backing off," he said. "I'll request a transfer to another division. Bree and I will end our relationship. You two can work on your marriage without any outside interference." I nodded thoughtfully. "That's an interesting proposal." "I'm glad you think so," he said, extending his hand. "I think we can both be reasonable about this." I looked at his outstretched hand but didn't take it. "There's just one problem with your plan." "What's that?" "I don't want to be reasonable," I said. "I want to watch you lose everything." His expression changed from confident to confused to angry in the space of about 3 seconds. "You can't be serious," he said. "I'm completely serious," I replied. "You see, Kyle, you made a fundamental error in judgment. You assumed that I was someone who could be negotiated with, someone who would be willing to compromise and find a middle ground. But what you failed to understand is that I'm not interested in middle ground. I'm interested in consequences." "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice hardening. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Actually, I know exactly who I'm dealing with," I said. "I'm dealing with a middle manager who thought he was clever enough to embezzle money and steal another man's wife without getting caught. I'm dealing with someone who's about to discover that he's not nearly as untouchable as he thought he was." Kyle's face was flushing red now. "You think you can threaten me? Do you have any idea what kind of connections I have? What kind of resources?" "I know you drive a BMW that's leased through the company," I said calmly. "I know you live in a condo that you're barely making payments on. I know your last performance review mentioned concerns about your judgment and decision-making. And I know that as of this morning, you're suspended pending an investigation that's going to uncover a lot more than just inappropriate expense approvals." "What are you talking about?" I smiled. "I'm talking about the fact that I didn't just report the consulting payments, Kyle. I reported everything. The expense account, irregularities, the company equipment that's been used for personal purposes, The client entertainment expenses that didn't involve any clients. The travel reimbursements for trips that were never taken. His face went pale. You can't prove any of that. I can prove all of it, I said, because I have access to the same financial systems that you've been manipulating for the past year. And unlike you, I know how to extract data without leaving digital fingerprints. You're lying. I pulled out my phone and showed him a screenshot of his corporate credit card statements. Am I? Kyle stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Here's what's going to happen, I continued. Tomorrow morning, Meridian's internal audit team is going to receive a very detailed report about financial irregularities in your department. By tomorrow afternoon, you're going to be terminated for cause. By the end of the week, you're going to be facing potential criminal charges for embezzlement. You can't do this, he said, but his voice was shaking now. I already did it, I replied. The only question now is whether you want to make things worse for yourself by continuing to stand on my porch and threaten me. Kyle looked around the neighborhood as if he was just noticing where he was. Several of my neighbors were outside, and they were definitely watching our conversation with interest. This isn't over, he said, backing toward his car. Yes, it is, I called after him. You just don't know it yet. He got into his BMW and drove away, tires squealing slightly as he turned the corner. I waved cheerfully at Mrs. Patterson, who was still standing in her yard with her dog, having clearly enjoyed the entire exchange. That evening, I drove to the Pit, a local bar where I occasionally met my friend Sam for drinks. Sam was a mechanic who owned his own shop, and he had the kind of practical wisdom that comes from fixing things that other people break. You look pleased with yourself, he said when I sat down at the bar. I'm having a good week, I replied. Cheryl, the bar owner, brought me a beer without being asked. Heard there was some excitement in your neighborhood today, she said with a grin. News travels fast, I observed. Faster when it involves someone getting what they deserve, she replied. Mrs. Patterson called her sister, who called her daughter, who works at the bank with my cousin. Apparently, your wife's been having some financial difficulties. I took a sip of my beer. Apparently. Also heard she's been spending a lot of time with that fancy fellow from her office, Cheryl continued, the one with the expensive car and the expensive suits. Is that so? Sam chuckled. Cheryl knows everything that happens in this town. You should have asked her for advice weeks ago. I didn't need advice, I said. I needed information, and I needed a plan. Well, you've definitely got people talking, Cheryl said. Question is, what are you going to do next? I finished my beer and put some money on the bar. I'm going to make sure everyone understands that there are consequences for their actions. Sounds like you've got it handled, Sam said. I'm just getting started, I replied. The next morning brought exactly the chaos I'd anticipated. By 7 a.m., my phone was buzzing with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Bree had apparently given my contact information to various people who wanted to discuss the situation. Her mother, Kyle's assistant, even someone from Meridian's legal department. I ignored them all. Instead, I drove to the office building where Meridian Financial was located. I'd done contract work there before, so security recognized me and didn't question my presence in the lobby. I positioned myself near the elevator bank with a newspaper and a cup of coffee, looking like someone waiting for a meeting. At 8:30, Kyle arrived, looking considerably less polished than he had the day before. His suit was wrinkled, his hair was disheveled, and he kept checking his phone with the desperate frequency of someone expecting bad news. At 8:45, Bree arrived with her mother in tow. Mrs. Carden was a thin, sharp-featured woman who'd never liked me, probably because I'd never been impressed by her attempts to manipulate her daughter's marriage for financial gain. Today, she looked furious and determined, which meant she probably thought she could intimidate someone into making this problem disappear. They were both wrong. At 9 days, Janet Morrison arrived with two people I didn't recognize, but who had the unmistakable look of corporate investigators. They went straight to the elevators without stopping at the security desk, which meant they had serious business to conduct. I finished my coffee and left the building. Phase 2 was complete. By noon, Sam had called to tell me that Kyle's BMW had been towed from the Meridian parking garage. "Repo truck," he said. "Looks like somebody missed some payments." By 2 p.m., Cheryl had called to report that Mrs. Carden had been to the bank 3 times, apparently trying to access accounts that were no longer available to her. By 4 p.m., Bree had called 17 times. I finally answered. "They fired him," she said without preamble. "They fired Kyle and they're talking about pressing charges." "That's unfortunate," I replied. "Darren, this has gone too far. You've made your point. Can't we please just—" "Where are you calling from?" I interrupted. "What? Where are you calling from? Your office, your car, Kyle's apartment?" There was a pause. "I'm at Kyle's place. He needed someone to what? To help him pack? To help him figure out how to explain to his landlord that he can't make rent? To help him deal with this nightmare that you created?" She snapped. "I didn't create anything," I said. "I just documented it. Everything that's happening to Kyle is the result of choices he made. Everything that's happening to you is the result of choices you made. I'm just the person who made sure those choices had consequences. You're destroying people's lives." "I'm revealing the lives people were already living," I corrected. "The lies, the theft, the betrayal, all of that existed before I got involved. I just made it visible." "What do you want?" she asked, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "I want you to understand that this is what accountability looks like," I said. "For months, you and Kyle thought you were clever enough to take whatever you wanted without paying any price for it. Now you're learning that you were wrong. So what happens now?" "Now you get to experience the full consequences of your choices," I said. "Both of you." I hung up and drove to Kyle's apartment complex. It was an upscale development that probably cost twice what he could afford on his legitimate salary, which explained why he'd been so creative with his expense accounts. His BMW was in the parking lot, but it had a bright yellow boot on the front wheel. There was also a notice taped to his door, probably from the leasing office. I parked across the street and waited. Around 6 p.m., Bree came out of the building, followed by Kyle. They were both carrying boxes, and Kyle was gesticulating angrily while Bree tried to calm him down. They loaded the boxes into Bree's car and drove away. I waited another hour, then walked up to Kyle's apartment. The notice on the door was indeed from the leasing office, a demand for immediate payment of overdue rent and fees. I took a photo of it with my phone. Then I walked around to the back of the building where the dumpsters were located. Kyle had apparently been throwing things away in his hurry to pack, and some of those things were interesting. Bank statements, credit card bills, and correspondence from various creditors. I collected everything that looked relevant and took it home to review. The picture that emerged was even worse than I'd expected. Kyle wasn't just financially irresponsible, he was financially desperate. He owed money to multiple credit card companies, his car loan was 3 months behind, and he'd been using cash advances to make his minimum payments. The consulting payments to Mrs. Carden weren't just theft, they were Kyle's attempt to generate enough extra income to keep his financial house of cards from collapsing, which meant that when I'd exposed the scheme, I hadn't just cost him his job. I'd triggered the complete collapse of his entire financial structure. I spent the evening organizing the documents and cross-referencing them with the information I'd already gathered. By midnight, I had a complete picture of Kyle's financial situation, including the names and contact information for most of his creditors. The next morning, I started making phone calls. "Hello?" I said to the first credit card company. "I have information about one of your account holders that you might find useful. Kyle Reddick, account number—" "Yes, I'll hold." By the end of the day, I'd spoken with 6 different creditors, Kyle's car loan company, his landlord, and his insurance provider. In each case, I'd simply provided them with publicly available information about his recent termination and the reasons for it. I didn't lie to anyone. I didn't make any false accusations. I just made sure that people who had legitimate financial interests in Kyle's situation were aware of the relevant facts. That evening, Bree called again. "They're taking his car," she said, "and his apartment, and his credit cards are all frozen." "That's what happens when you can't make your payments," I replied. "You did this," she accused. "You called his creditors." "I provided factual information to people who had a legitimate need to know it," I said. "What they chose to do with that information was their decision." "He has nowhere to go," she said. "That's not my problem." "Darren, please. He's talking about leaving town. He says there's nothing left for him here." "There isn't," I agreed. "That's the point." "What about me?" she asked quietly. "What about you? What happens to me in all this?" I looked out the window at our quiet suburban street. Normal people living normal lives, probably not wondering whether their spouses were going to destroy them for their betrayals. "That depends," I said. "On what?" "On whether you've learned anything from watching what happened to Kyle." There was a long silence. "I have," she said finally. "Good," I replied, "because your education is just beginning." 3 days later, Kyle left town. He'd loaded what remained of his possessions into a rented truck and driven away without telling anyone where he was going. Bree found out when she went to his apartment and discovered it empty, except for a note that said, "I can't do this anymore. Don't try to find me." She called me from the empty apartment crying. "He's gone," she said between sobs. "He just left. Without saying goodbye, without explaining anything, he just ran away." "That's what cowards do," I replied. "They run when things get difficult." "I loved him," she said, and the pain in her voice was genuine. "No," I said. "You loved the idea of him. You loved the excitement, the secrecy, the feeling that you were getting away with something, but you didn't love him. If you had, you would have left me first instead of trying to have both." "I made a mistake," she whispered. "You made a series of choices," I corrected. "And now you're experiencing the consequences of those choices. What happens now? Now we finish this." I'd been planning the final phase for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Kyle's departure had provided that moment. With him gone, Bree was isolated, vulnerable, and finally ready to face the full scope of what she'd done. The next morning, I served her with divorce papers. She was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and staring out the window. She looked older than she had a month ago, worn down by stress and uncertainty. "Good morning," I said, placing the legal documents on the table in front of her. She looked down at the papers, then up at me. "Divorce?" "Dissolution of marriage," I corrected, citing irreconcilable differences, financial misconduct, and adultery. She picked up the papers and started reading. "You're asking for everything. The house, the savings, the retirement accounts." "I'm asking for what I'm entitled to under the circumstances," I said, "which is everything that isn't specifically yours by law." "This is vindictive. This is justice," she continued reading. "You're also asking for alimony? From me?" "Spousal support," I corrected, "to compensate for the financial damage caused by your misconduct." "I don't have any money," she said. "I lost my job, remember? That's not my problem." She set the papers down and looked at me with something approaching hatred. "You've really thought this through, haven't you? Every detail, every angle. You've planned this whole thing like a military campaign." "I've been thorough," I agreed, "and you're enjoying it." "I'm satisfied by it," I said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" She stood up and walked to the window. "You've destroyed my career, my relationship, my financial security, and now you want to take everything else too. How is that not vindictive?" "Because vindictive implies that I'm acting out of spite or malice," I said. "I'm not. I'm acting out of a desire for accountability. You took things that didn't belong to you. My trust, my financial security, my marriage. Now you get to experience what it feels like to have things taken from you. So this is about revenge." This is about consequences, I corrected. Revenge would be irrational, emotional, disproportionate. This is simply cause and effect. You made choices that harmed me, and now you're experiencing the natural results of those choices. She turned back to face me. What if I fight it? What if I hire a lawyer and contest everything? Then you'll lose, I said simply. And you'll lose expensively. I have documentation of everything. The financial misconduct, the adultery, the lies. No lawyer is going to be able to make that go away. You really have thought of everything. I tried to. She sat back down at the table and stared at the divorce papers. How long do I have? To respond? 30 days? To move out? 60 days? And if I sign everything now? Then it's over. You walk away with your personal belongings and whatever money you have in your individual accounts. I keep everything else, and we never have to see each other again. She was quiet for a long time, reading through the papers and probably calculating whether she had any realistic alternatives. There's something I need to know, she said finally. What? Did you ever love me? Really love me? Or was I just convenient? I considered the question seriously. I loved who I thought you were, the person you pretended to be when we got married, but that person apparently never existed. She did exist, Bree said quietly, for a while. But somewhere along the way, I lost track of her. When? I don't know. Maybe when I realized that you were never going to be ambitious enough to give me the life I wanted. Maybe when Kyle started paying attention to me in a way that you hadn't in years. Maybe when I discovered that I could take things that I wanted instead of waiting for someone to give them to me. And now? Now I understand that taking things has a price, she said. And I understand that you're not the person I thought you were either. Who did you think I was? Someone who would forgive me, she said. Someone who would be hurt, but would ultimately want to work things out. Someone who would choose love over justice. Maybe I would have, I said. If you'd come to me honestly, if you'd told me the truth, if you'd asked for forgiveness instead of trying to cover everything up. But you didn't. You chose to lie, to steal, and to continue betraying me, even after I discovered what you were doing. So, there's no possibility of forgiveness? No chance that we could start over? I looked at her sitting there with the divorce papers in front of her, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. She looked lost, defeated, genuinely remorseful. But then I remembered the months of lies, the stolen money, the photographs of her with Kyle, the way she'd looked me in the eye and lied about where she'd been and what she'd been doing. No, I said. There's no chance of that. She nodded slowly and picked up a pen. I need a few minutes to read through everything. Take your time. I left her alone with the papers and went to my office. From my window, I could see Mrs. Patterson walking her dog, Mr. Chen working in his garden, and kids riding bicycles in the street. Normal people living normal lives, probably not signing divorce papers that would end their marriages and leave them with nothing. An hour later, Bree knocked on my office door. I signed everything, she said, holding out the papers. I took them and reviewed her signatures. Everything was properly executed. Thank you, I said. For what? For making this easy. You could have dragged it out, made it expensive and complicated. I appreciate that you didn't. I didn't have a choice, she said. We both know I was never going to win this fight. No, I agreed. You weren't. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking around my office as if she was seeing it for the first time. I'll be gone by the end of the week, she said. Where will you go? I don't know yet. My mother's house, maybe, until I can find a job and get back on my feet. Good luck with that. She looked at me one last time. I hope you're happy, Darren. I hope this gives you everything you wanted. It gives me what I needed, I replied. Justice, accountability, consequences. And is that enough? I considered the question. Was it enough? Was the satisfaction of seeing her lose everything worth the destruction of my marriage, the months of planning and scheming, the complete upheaval of my life? Yes, I said. It's enough. She nodded and left the office. I heard her going upstairs to pack, and then I heard the front door close for the last time. I sat in my office for a while, looking out at the quiet suburban street where normal people were living normal lives. Tomorrow, I would be one of them again. Just another divorced man starting over, but starting over with the knowledge that actions have consequences and that justice, even delayed, is still justice. The card had been declined. The trip was canceled.